Good evening. I'm Isabella with the Engagement Department at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's virtual member lecture, Life and the Afterlife in Ancient Egypt. We're so glad to have you joining us virtually, and we hope that this digital format can offer a chance to stay connected to the Art Institute from home. We'll begin with a brief review of some of the features we'll be using today. This program will be shared in presentation mode, so we have turned off video and microphones for attendees. For optimal viewing, please select full screen mode under View Options in the top right corner of your screen. Throughout the presentation, you're invited to share questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we look forward to answering some of those at the end of this presentation. Closed captions are available and can be turned on via the controls at the bottom of the screen as well. If you encounter any technical difficulties during today's program, again, please let us know in the Q&A and we'll do our best to assist you. This program is being recorded, so if you'd like to revisit it in the future, you'll be welcome to do so. Speaking to themes found throughout this new installation tonight is Ashley Arico. Ashley serves as the museum's assistant curator of ancient Egyptian art in our Arts of Africa department. Since joining the Art Institute in 2017 as the museum's first full-time specialist in the arts of ancient Egypt, she has launched a successful Egyptian art pop-up talk series and installed Ptolemaic Egyptian works in the Mary and Michael Jaharis galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art. Ashley also received a BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and holds an MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University, where her research focused on Egyptian statuary as evidence for interconnections in the ancient world. Now, Ashley, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Izzy, for that lovely introduction, and to all of you for being here today. This is truly an exciting moment as we celebrate the opening of our brand new permanent Gallery of the Arts of Ancient Egypt. As many of you will know, this is the first time that our ancient Egyptian collection will be on view in a decade. I, along with all of my many colleagues throughout the museum at the Art Institute who have brought this dynamic new display to life, are delighted to invite all of you to experience these wonderful ancient artworks again. With our time this evening, I would like to take a closer look at how some of the objects from our collection reflect aspects of life and the afterlife in ancient Egypt, concepts that, as you will see, were very intertwined, because the Egyptians viewed the afterlife as a continuation of life here on Earth, with many of the same needs and desires, including the need to work, to eat, and to drink, but also the wish to be surrounded by loved ones in an existence that, through careful planning during one's lifetime, could perhaps be a bit more leisurely than life was the first time around. As this charming wooden model of a boat that was carved and painted 4,000 years ago attests, ancient Egyptian culture was centered around the Nile River. What we call ancient Egypt today was one of many cultures that arose along the Nile River during antiquity, with tributaries starting in what is today Uganda and Ethiopia that meet in Sudan and then flow north into Egypt. The river extends over 4,000 miles through Eastern Africa. This Google Earth image, zoomed in closer on Egypt, gives a sense of just how vital the river is to life in Egypt, even today. In ancient times, the river's annual flood brought dark, fertile soil that supported abundant growth in agriculture, a stark contrast to the dangerous but minerally rich deserts on either side. For millennia, most Egyptians have lived along this narrow strip of land. The Nile also served as a superhighway of sorts, connecting the villages, towns, and cities along its banks. It facilitated travel, commerce, and religious pilgrimages. Wealthy Egyptians who had the resources to commit to preparing for the afterlife wanted continued access to this important aspect of daily life. And so they had boats depicted in their tombs, or models of boats, like the one we're looking at right now, included in their burial chambers. This practice reveals an ancient Egyptian approach to provisioning life after death that scholars sometimes call substitution. Basically, anything present in the tomb would exist for its owner in the afterlife in its true form. This means that if you wanted to take a boat with you to the afterlife, you could be buried with a full-sized boat, as some kings were. We have a great example of that here in Chicago at the Field Museum. Or with a model of a boat, like this one, a drawing or a wall carving depicting a boat, or even the word boat written in hieroglyphs. All would be equally functional for their owner. Our model boat is equipped with a crew of 15 people, 14 individually carved rowers and a helmsman who stands at one end. Because the Nile River flows south to north, but the prevailing winds move north to south, this riverboat has a mast in case a sail, which is now missing, is needed, and oars so that the crew can row down the river or sail up it. The boat is just one of dozens of objects that span 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history that are now on view on our lower level. Here you can see an overhead plan of how the gallery is laid out. Rather than arranging things chronologically, objects are presented thematically in vignettes that explore topics such as ancient Egyptian artists, religious practice, and how to protect oneself for the afterlife. Roughly speaking, the northern half of the gallery focuses on the afterlife, while the southern part focuses on life. But of course, in ancient Egypt, this division was not always as clean-cut as it might seem at first glance. And so, for the remainder of our time, let's take a closer look at some of the objects that you will see in the gallery and what they can teach us about the balance between life and the afterlife in this ancient African culture. Our first object is a relief fragment that depicts men catching birds. It comes from a very small chapel that would have been made of just 3 decorated slabs of stone, one central panel with 2 side panels projecting at a 90-degree angle. This is a fragment of one of those side panels. Such chapels were places where Egyptians could come leave offerings and recite prayers on behalf of the deceased to ensure that she or he would have access to all the food, drink, and luxuries that they would need to live comfortably in eternity. This example was made for a man named Ipi, who lived around 4,000 years ago. You can still see a portion of his head at the bottom of the fragment. This is where he would have been depicted seated, receiving the goods being offered to him. His name is written in hieroglyphs in the highlighted portion above. One thing that makes working with Egyptian artifacts so fascinating is that because of the interplay between text and image in their art, we know the names of so many men and women who lived and died thousands of years ago. This was by design. The concept of causing one's name to live on by continuing to have it spoken amongst the living was very important to the ancient Egyptians. And so we'll try to recite their names as much as we can. As an example of how this aspect of writing was very much an art form in its own right, I've highlighted here one of Ipi's many titles, the Overseer of the Army. So here you see the 2 signs, the owl and the mouth that form the word overseer, followed by a kneeling archer equipped with a bow and arrows and a feather on his head, the writing of the word troops. So even though we just have here text that is meant to be read, it's still very artistic in its approach. Next slide, please. But the main scene that I wanted to focus on for this object tonight is this very lively image of 2 men pulling a clap net closed. Everyday life provided an imaginative blueprint for the artwork that we see on the walls of ancient Egyptian tombs. Although this is an image that was produced for a funerary context, it reflects lived experience. And because of this, a lot of quote unquote funerary art has a lot to teach us about living in ancient Egypt as well. So as you look at this scene, you should imagine yourself looking at a relaxing pool teeming with waterfowl like ducks. Lotus flowers and lily pads float on the surface of the water as the birds who were relaxed a moment ago are in the process of being trapped. So we're looking down from above on a clap net just at the moment that the men on the right, who are hidden behind a blind of reeds, are pulling it shut, trapping the birds inside. And you'll see a few lucky birds have escaped and are flying up to freedom, while the rest remain kind of chaotically trapped inside the net. A daily life scene like this one would have been very important for Ibby in eternity, providing him with birds to eat, but also with the men needed to capture them. Next slide, please. All right. As I mentioned in my brief overview earlier, the new gallery space is arranged thematically, not chronologically. And one of these themes is personal appearance, or how the Egyptians presented themselves both in daily life through the use of cosmetics, clothing, and jewelry, and for posterity in their statues and relief sculptures. This round-topped funerary stela speaks to both aspects of that theme. It was made to commemorate a man named Amenemhat and his mother Yatu, who lived a couple hundred years after Ibby. The vibrant red, yellow, blue, black, and white pigments are original to this remarkably well-preserved artwork and give us a sense of what most of the sculptures on view in the gallery would have looked like during antiquity. While we often experience them today as monotone, when they were made, they would have been boldly painted. A stela is a slab of decorated stone. Ancient Egyptians created stelae for many purposes: to document historical events, to record royal decrees, and, as in this example, to remember their dead. This is the type of artifact that perfectly encapsulates the permeable barrier between the realms of the living and of the dead, because it was designed to provide a point of interaction between those still here on Earth and the deceased Amenemhat and Yatu, who are shown in the central scene. The inscription at the top is a very formulaic prayer that we as the viewer are meant to read aloud when we encounter this stela. When it was new, the inscription would have been quite striking. If you look closely, you can see remnants of the bright blue pigment that filled each hieroglyph, providing a stark contrast to the vibrant yellow ground. This pigment is the world's earliest known synthetic blue pigment. Known as Egyptian blue today, the ancient Egyptians called it chesbed irit, which translates to lapis lazuli that has been made. Lapis lazuli is a costly blue stone found in Afghanistan that had been imported into Egypt since very early times. This synthetic version on this stela, which is made of copper, chalk, and lime, was much more cost-effective. So what does the text say? Reading from right to left and top to bottom, it starts, Hetep Denisu Usir Anktawi Df Parrot Heru Ta Henket Kau Abadu Chesmenket, or more fully in English, a gift that the king gives to Osiris, the lord of Anktawi, that he might give voice offerings consisting of bread, beer, oxen, fowl, travertine, and clothing, and every good and pure thing one lives upon, to the Ka, or the soul, of the follower Amenemhat, and his mother, whom he loves, Yatu. The fact that we can read these ancient words after so many years is quite remarkable. In fact, when this object came to the Art Institute in 1892, the tools to read this text had only been recovered 70 years earlier in 1822, when French philologist Jean-Francois Champollion deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs with the aid of the Rosetta Stone. And I'll note that this year marks the bicentennial of that important achievement. Moving down the stela, we are presented with an image of Yatu and her son Amenemhat in the state that they wanted to exist in for eternity, in the prime of their lives and with the trappings of high social status. On the left, Yatu sits on an elegant chair with feet in the shape of lion's paws and a plush cushioned back. Wearing a long white linen dress accessorized with beaded anklets and bracelets, She holds a lotus flower to her face. The lotus was a symbol of rebirth to the Egyptians, who related the flower's habit of sinking below the water at night and reopening at dawn to the sun god's daily journey. In ancient Egyptian belief, the sun died each night at sunset, traveled through the underworld, and then was reborn in the east at dawn. Egyptians hoped that they too would be reborn after death. As you move through the gallery, you'll see several examples of the lotus flower being used in this context. On the right side, a seated Amenemhat holds a flail, a symbol of rank, in his right hand. His dark red skin contrasts that of his mother, whose complexion is painted yellow. This color differentiation in depicting males and females in ancient Egypt is thought to derive from the fact that the work of men largely took place outside of the house, where they had more opportunities to tan, while the domain of women was indoors. Like Yatu, Amenemhat is fashionably dressed. He wears a white knee-length kilt and a sheer mid-calf length overall. Fine see-through fabric like this would have been costlier than linen used for average garments, and again highlights Amenemhat's access to wealth, or at least his aspiration to have access to it in the next life. Mother and son are separated by an offering table filled with the food and drinks that they will consume in perpetuity in the afterlife. While the individual objects may seem to almost float in midair to our modern eyes, in their ancient context, we should understand the context of this scene as representing a single table laden with goods. To avoid overlap and ensure that each object is readily identifiable, the artist has arranged things vertically. Many of the items are the same things that were listed in the inscription above, including loaves of bread, jars of beer, cuts of meat, and poultry. In addition to foodstuffs, on this stela, Amenemhat and Yatu also want luxury goods, in this case, cosmetics. One item, represented using a larger scale than the other images in the scene, is placed under each chair, a position of prominence. The distinctive shapes of these objects enable us to identify them as an ointment vessel under Yatu's chair, and a jar of coal with the applicator sticking out under Amenemhat's. In Egypt's dry, bright climate, ointments that could soothe the skin and coal, a black eye paint with medicinal properties that helped reflect the sun, were an important part of self-care and contributed to Egyptians' appearances in everyday life. One of my favorite things about this stela is the artist's use of the Egyptian blue pigment that we were talking about a moment ago on Amenemhat's jar, which likely indicates that the coal jar is made from anhydrite, a beautiful blue stone that was popular for small vessels during this period. You can see an example of such a vessel in the collection here on the left. I'm giving you here two examples of cosmetic jars, a lidded ointment vessel made of anhydrite and a travertine coal jar that, if you were to remove the lid, still contains eye makeup after all these thousands of years. Such objects are so well preserved because they were buried with their owners. Now displayed in conversation with the stela of Amenemhat and Hemet, or Amenemhat and Yatu, excuse me, as well as other beauty items like jewelry and a copper alloy mirror. These are the types of daily life objects that could have been used in life, but also magically after death. Displays of piety and evidence for how the ancient Egyptians worshiped their gods is also a key focus in several areas of the new gallery. Over the long duration of ancient Egyptian history, practices changed, so it is important not to understand these works as speaking for the whole of ancient Egyptian culture. Nonetheless, they have something important to tell us about how the Egyptians conducted themselves in life, and also what they wanted to be remembered for in death. This beautiful piece of carved limestone comes from the Saqqara tomb of a man named Inuya and his wife Yui. Inuya worked under King Tutankhamun during a period of religious change. For those familiar with ancient Egyptian history, This is just following the Amarna period, when Pharaoh Akhenaten changed Egyptian religion to focus almost solely on the worship of the sun disk, or the Aten. The lintel would have crowned a doorway in their tomb chapel, which would have been accessible to visitors after their deaths. On one end of the lintel, Inuya and Yui are shown kneeling with their hands raised in front of their faces. This is an ancient Egyptian gesture of worship or praise, and you will see it a few times more in this lecture, as well as on several objects throughout the gallery. Their worship is directed towards a group of funerary gods. Twice we see Osiris, the ruler of the underworld, identifiable not only by the inscriptions, but also by the crook and flail that he holds in his hands. You'll note that the Osiris on the far end of the lintel is facing the opposite direction. This is because something is missing. Ancient Egyptian art defaulted towards symmetry. When complete, this lintel would have been symmetrical, with another image of the kneeling couple at the other end. Osiris is accompanied by his sister wife Isis and his sister Nephthys. Both goddesses hold the Ankh, a hieroglyph for the word life, in their hands. In its original context, this lintel would have been a powerful statement to visitors about the piety of Inuya and Yui, something they hoped would encourage the living to provide offerings and say prayers, like the prayer that we saw on the stela of Amenemhat-Niatu, on their behalves. Depictions of worship are not the only way that we gain insight into worship in ancient Egypt within the new gallery, however. This beautiful copper alloy statuette of the god Osiris highlights the transactional nature of worship during this period, when worshippers purchased metal statues of the gods to be dedicated in their temples as votive gifts. That is to say, gifts offered in thanks for answered prayers or as encouragement so that the god would look favorably upon the petitioner. Here Osiris is shown in a mummiform state. He was, after all, the first Egyptian to be mummified, according to myth. His hands peek out from his mummy shroud to hold the crook and the flail, symbols of his position as a king. The work is remarkably detailed, from the delicate carving on his plumed crown to the details on the beaded broad collar that encircles his neck. You can see this level of detail on another statuette in the gallery that depicts the falcon-headed god Re-Harakti. Re-Harakti was a version of the sun god in ancient Egypt. This piece, which still retains some of its original gilding and other metal inlays, gives a sense of how these objects would have appeared when they were made. Namely, that we shouldn't be thinking of them as dark green sculptures, but as vibrant polychromatic works of art that celebrate the gods in ancient Egypt. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a detail, one of my favorites throughout the gallery, on the statue, on the belt of the god, where the artist has very carefully written his name, Re-Harakti, chief of the gods, in very tiny, small golden hieroglyphs. Next slide, please. Artistic practice is another important theme in the new gallery. Because artists worked in teams within a canon and did not customarily sign their work, it is often difficult to speak about specific artists or specific people involved in the arts in ancient Egypt. Neferhotep, the man depicted on this stela fragment, was one such man involved in the arts. He lived a little over 3,000 years ago in a village known today as Deir el-Medina, which is located on Luxor's west bank. In ancient times, this village was called Set Ma'at, the place of truth. Here you see the remains of that village, which includes ancient homes, but also tombs belonging to the people who lived there. For several generations, this government-sponsored village was home to the men responsible for creating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, which is on the opposite side of this mountain, and in the Valley of the Queens. Although the hieroglyphic inscription at the top of this object is broken, James Hoffmeyer has demonstrated that it once named Neferhotep, the foreman of the workers in the place of truth. We know from other sources that Neferhotep came from a family of foremen in this community, as was customary in ancient Egypt, jobs and titles often passed from father to son. The foremen were the wealthiest and most powerful people within this workmen's village, serving as intermediaries between the state and the workmen themselves. Because major architectural projects, like the creation of a tomb or an addition to a temple, were major undertakings, the work was usually divided between two teams, one working on the right side and the other on the left. During life, Neferhotep would have been responsible for one of these teams. This also meant that he had access to some of the most skilled artisans of his era. This really shows in our beautiful relief, which shows Neferhotep praising in a similar pose to what we just saw with Nuya and Yui. We know that the village artisans traded their skills for the production of private works on days when they were not working on state-funded projects. And as Emily Teeter has noted, this stela was probably commissioned in this fashion from one of Neferhotep's neighbors. We can reconstruct a sense of what the original stela would have looked like when complete from comparable examples, including a stela now in the British Museum, which also depicts Neferhotep. Kneeling in the bottom corner, you see Neferhotep with his hands raised in worship. In front of him, hieroglyphs narrate his pious act. In the upper, round top portion of the stela, we find the focus of his worship, King Amenhotep I and his mother Ahmose Nefertari, who were worshipped in Deir el-Medina as the deified founders of the village. While we do not know whom Neferhotep was worshipping on our stela fragment, we can be sure that the overall arrangement of the scene would have been similar, placing a respectable distance between the mortal at the bottom of the slab and the divine in the upper portion. Such an object would have been placed in a publicly accessible area, in this case, perhaps outside Neferhotep's tomb, where he could be seen worshiping the gods for all eternity. The artists working at Deir el-Medina were prolific and also produced more minor works, from simple doodles to elaborate drawings on ostraca like this example. An ostracon is a sherd of broken pottery or a flake of limestone, in this case, the remnants from carving tombs from the cliffs, most likely, that is repurposed for writing and or drawing. This image, drawn on a flake of limestone, is the oldest drawing in the holdings of the Art Institute. Made around 3,100 years ago, the drawing depicts an unnamed king, or more probably a statue of an unnamed king, in profile. On his head, he wears a crown with streamers hanging down at the nape of his neck and a uraeus serpent at his brow. This protective element to Egyptian royal attire was meant to spit fire into the eyes of the king's enemies. In the crook of his arm, he supports a standard or a staff that is topped with the head of a ram and a solar disk, also wearing a uraeus serpent. The combination of the ram form and the sun tells the viewer that this is a representation of the god Amun-Re, the king of the gods, whose Karnak temple in what is today Luxor remains one of the largest religious structures in the world to this day. In fact, the temple is easily visible across the river from the village of Deir el-Medina. Carrying the staff in procession would have been an important part of the living king's religious responsibilities as an intercessor between his subjects and the gods. Our ostracon may have been a humble sketch, or perhaps even an object of devotion. The fact that the image was protected and not drawn over, together with the general shape of the flake, which resembles the round-top stele we saw earlier, may point towards a religious use. This is also supported by an interesting text added to the back of the ostracon in hieratic, the cursive form of the Egyptian language. It records an appearance of King Amenhotep, who, as we just learned, was worshipped as a god in this community long after his death. Festivals celebrating this divinized king included parading statues of him throughout the town, and perhaps this drawing records the artist's encounter with one such royal statue. A final theme that I want to touch on tonight, which is recurrent throughout the new gallery, is protection for the afterlife. We have already seen several examples of how art helped elite Egyptians prepare for the afterlife, But the journey there could be perilous, and so the Egyptians also used objects imbued with sacred words and powerful symbols to protect themselves. One such object is the funerary papyrus of a woman named Tayu Henutmut. This scroll is made up of 5 papyrus sheets. During antiquity, the papyrus plant grew readily in the marshes of Egypt. When cut into strips, layered, pounded flat, and then dried, the plant formed a material similar to paper that was easy to write on. The center 3 pages of this scroll contain chapters from a religious text that the Egyptians called the Book of Going Forth by Day. Today, you will more commonly see this text referred to as the Book of the Dead, because it was designed to be buried with its owner to help them transition into the afterlife. The Book of Going Forth by Day is not really a book in our modern sense of the word, but a group of over 200 spells or chapters from which selections were made. For example, Tayu Henutmut's scroll contains 5 chapters, including one for causing a man, or in this case a woman, to remember their name, and another for not letting the heart be taken from the deceased. Preservation of the heart was vital to surviving the transition to the afterlife, because at the final judgment before the gods, the heart was weighed against the feather of justice. If you had led a bad life and the scale did not balance, your soul would be wiped out from existence. To aid in reading, the first line of each chapter was written in red ink, which you can see in this example. And looking closely at the image, you see Tayu Henutmut raising her hands again in this gesture of worship before the god Osiris, the ruler of the underworld, who is the one who has the ability to let her into the next life. In the next slide, we'll see another type of object that incorporates text from the Book of the Dead, shabti or ushabti. These figurines, which were made in many periods of Egyptian history, are inscribed with an individual spell from the Book of the Dead that enchants them to work on their owner's behalf in the afterlife. One version of this spell tells us that when the person who owned the shabti is called upon in order to do any work yonder in the netherworld or any unpleasant task that is imposed upon him there, the figurine is supposed to jump up and say, "Look, here I am." And then the spell goes on to enumerate what some of the things that you might be called upon to do including cultivating the fields, irrigating the riverbanks, ferrying sand from the east to the west, or vice versa. All tasks that the Egyptians hoped to be able to avoid in their next lives. On the next slide, we'll see another later example of one of these ushabti figure from about 1,000 years later. By the time this man, Hor Uja, lived, people who had the means to produce a full burial assemblage would be buried with one of these figurines for every day of the year. In addition, they would be buried with an overseer for every 10 figurines, just to make sure that their eternity was really covered. On the next slide, you'll see how the figurine has been equipped to perform this agricultural labor for its owner in the afterlife. It holds an agricultural pick and a hoe, and on the back of its, slung over its shoulder, it has a bag of seeds. So it's all ready to go work in the fields on behalf of Hor Uja. Next slide, please. And of course, there were other ways of protecting oneself for eternity, most famously through mummification, which preserved the body. This really striking, beautiful mask would have been placed over one such mummified individual. The gilding on the face speaks to this person's hope to be reborn in the afterlife in a semi-divine state, because the ancient Egyptians believed that their gods had skin of gold. And throughout the mask, it is decorated with imagery and symbolism that will help aid its owner in this quest. Particularly notable is at the forehead, the small wedgeot eye, or eye of Horus. Next slide, please. So wedgeot in ancient Egyptian means to be whole or healthy or sound. And this was the type of symbol that Egyptians would have worn both in life and in death to ensure a safe well-being and nice existence. Next slide, please. So in closing, I want to reiterate what a moment of celebration this is. Celebration for the enduring legacy of the ancient Egyptian artists and artisans whose crafts we have the privilege of being able to enjoy even after so many thousands of years. Celebration of the dedicated research on these objects conducted by many generations of Chicago area scholars that have unveiled deeper meanings behind many of the works on view. And celebration of the fact that all of us once again have the opportunity to behold this beautiful collection that is such a testament to human artistic achievement. And with that, I invite you to go visit the new Gallery of the Arts of Ancient Egypt on your next visit to the Art Institute. Thank you, and now I will turn things back to Izzy.
Thank you, Ashley, for that great presentation. It was great hearing you talk about this after seeing the gallery, so I appreciate the additional context there. And I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. So let me begin by asking you which of the objects in that exhibition space was the most difficult to install?
That's a really good question. If Alex could put up this slide, like go to slide number 2, I could show you an example of one of them if we have the PowerPoint available. So I think probably the most complicated was our coffin of Nessi-Pa-Herhot. This is the first time that this object has been on view in 80 years, and it's very fragile. And as you can see, we worked, very closely with our amazing mount maker to make a display of this piece where the object kind of floats, which of course, takes a lot of engineering and kind of thinking through, and then also, a lot of manpower to lift this large piece into space. And another one that was difficult was there's a very large stone stela, which of course, many of the pieces I talked about tonight are stone, which means they're very heavy. So getting them lifted into place can be a challenge, but we work with an amazing team of art handlers that helps us with that.
Do the objects in the gallery reflect tastes of the previous kings or artisans, or was each period entirely unique in how they chose to represent these images?
That's a very good question. So as I mentioned, we need to remember that ancient Egypt lasted for a very long time. So there are definitely themes that are continuous throughout, but just like any, art or any other kind of fashion, preferences change. So we can date things kind of based on the style that is used, but the core functions of many of these objects kind of endure throughout.
Got it. We had a couple questions about the colors themselves. So is there a good reference to see an interpretation of the ancient color palette that was used originally in many of the artifacts? And would most objects have included that type of vibrant decoration?
So yeah, so when we're looking at ancient art generally, not just from ancient Egypt, we should imagine that things were very vibrantly painted. So in our collection, we're lucky to have several of our Egyptian works still have the color preserved. So our conservation scientists can, do tests to see what those pigments were made of to kind of extrapolate what the pigments would have been on other objects. And also there's a lot we can do now with science and imaging that allow us to see things that weren't visible with the naked eye. So we're constantly doing research to learn more about what the colors are and try to reconstruct in our own minds what it might have looked like when it was made. And yeah, there are some blog posts about color in the ancient world on our website that may be of interest to people that want to see that.
Perfect. Were the books of the dead made specifically for each new person? And how many different versions of this text exist out there, if you know?
It's hard to say how many versions exist because, like I said, there's like 200 spells that you could choose from, and some are obviously more popular than others. But so there are many different versions. In terms of how they are made, it really depends. Sometimes it's quite clear that they're pre-manufactured and then the name of the owner is added in later. And you can often tell that because either the person has a very short name, maybe too much space was left in the text, or if they have a very long name, maybe the scribe is really working to cram it in there. One of the really interesting things about our papyrus of this woman, Tayu Henetbut, is at the very top of it, if you look closely, you can see what looks like a little scribble. And that's where the scribe has written in just like everyday writing, not fancy writing, her name. So it seems that, she or whoever was purchasing the papyrus for her, probably went into the workshop, said, this is the papyrus I want. They were like, okay, we're going to inscribe it for this person. And then the scribe that was very skilled in writing went back later and added all the texts in with her name. So
That's great. And then another question related to the afterlife. Is the Gilt funerary mask the image of a man or a woman? And how can one actually tell in the case of busts as opposed to full figure representations?
That is an excellent question. And we don't know if it belongs in this case to a man or a woman, because that style of funerary mask is very kind of idealized. And this is true for many aspects of Egyptian art throughout, the ancient period, is that since they had such an idealized way of representing human beings, they don't have a sense of portraiture like we might think of today. The way that you specified who you were looking at was by writing the person's name on the object, like those funerary figurines that are meant to work on behalf of their owners that we were just looking at, the ushabtis. So since this mask does not have a name on it, we have no idea whether it was initially made for a man or a woman.
Got it. And this is going to tease your upcoming April talk a little bit, but has there been any restoration or preservation work done on these pieces, or are they displayed as they were found?
Yes, so as Izzy notes, I will be doing another talk in April with our amazing conservator, Rachel Sabino, where we'll be talking a little bit about how we prepared these works to go back on view. But generally speaking, what you see is what was preserved. So we try to stabilize things, but in most cases, like especially with the pigments, what you're looking at is what was put there thousands of years ago.
Great. And I think I'll close this out with this final question, but could you speak to how the new gallery arrangement was decided upon and how long it took to carry that out?
That's a good question. So we worked on this. This was a pandemic project for us. So we pretty much have done it over the last 2 years. And in the space, we really wanted to think about, how much the ancient Egyptians, their culture was really rooted in the sense of duality. So like I said, you have the river and the desert, you have life and death, you have day and night. So it was something that was very important to them. And so we wanted to kind of portray that dual aspect while giving you kind of glimpses into different aspects of Egyptian culture that were, enduring through these periods. And we wanted to make sure we gave everybody a chance to look really closely at some of these wonderful objects, because as I hope you've seen in this presentation, so many of them are so wonderfully detailed. So they really benefit from a lot of close looking.
They really do. And the way that you have those cases displayed against the wall is just great. So I hope everyone gets a chance to see that.
Yeah.
I'd like to close this out. So thank you again, Ashley, for sharing your time with us this evening. And thank you to all of our members for joining us for this evening's program. And like Ashley said, we hope you enjoyed this presentation and have a chance to view this new installation, which can be found in Gallery 50. And for more information on our upcoming virtual events and Ashley's April talk, please visit us online at artic.edu and look for our monthly e-news in your inboxes. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.